Hello furry and hello fellow writers. I am Reno. I go by Arcane Reno online. You can find my work under that name on sites like SoFurry and Furry Affinity. I've been writing for about 12 years now. The latter portion of that semi-professionally. I've had some of my work published in anthologies, and I also do some editorial work for online games, and I've had some work published outside the fandom in some magazines and small press. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit today about character building. And I wanted to talk a little bit about writing characters that are more effective and how we can, some practical tools we can use to build more effective characters for our writing. Now, having strong characters is essential for any good story, but in furry writing in particular, it's very important because furry writing tends to centralize on characters a lot. Character is something that's very central to the community, more so perhaps in other genres even. You might have heard of something called the mice quotient. That's a term that was coined by Orson Scott Card, and that's referring to what elements of a story are strongest. And in my experience, most furry stories tend to lean towards character or idea part of the quotient, more so than the other two. So all that to say that characters are really the backbone of the story in a lot of cases. Now, throughout the video I'm going to be referring to a few different sources, and I'm going to have the links in the description below. And that's something you can check out later as additional resources. Now, a good starting point is to consider the question of what is a character? And that may sound like an obvious question, but what I really want to get at is the function of the character. A character is anyone who shows up in the story, right? And yes, that's true. But a character has a role to play in a story. They aren't just on screen without a reason, generally speaking. Characters are not real people, even though the best characters create an effective illusion of being a real person. Essentially, characters are a lot simpler than real people, and because of that we can kind of break them down into their component parts. So within the structure of a story, characters each have a role to play. So there's sort of two aspects of this. You have your sort of traditional literary roles, like your protagonist and your antagonist. And then you have things like character foils, and you might have side characters, and you might have characters who almost aren't characters but play a role in the plot. Like, you know, if you look back to things like the princess to save, the damsel in distress, those almost aren't characters. They're more plot devices than they are characters. So there was an episode of Writing Excuses where they had on Lou Anders, who's a editorial director for Pure Books, and he discussed something called what he called the Hollywood formula. And with the Hollywood formula model, so you can look at various movies and kind of pick them apart with this technique. He described it as you have your protagonist, who's of course your main character, but most importantly your protagonist is somebody who wants something, and something that is something that is going to be central to the plot of the movie. And then your antagonist is the character who's standing in the way of the protagonist getting what they want. And then you have something called the relationship character, and that's who's going to be articulating the movie's theme. So we can look at these various roles, and we want to try and slot our characters in where they need to be. So if you if you're going to have a character appear in the story and be more than sort of background dressing, or you want to figure out where they fit into the grand scheme of things. Now, of course, when we have things like ensemble casts, that can get a little bit more complicated. You might have multiple point of view characters. Generally speaking, you're probably going to have one character that's a little more central than the rest, your main protagonist, but you might have multiple protagonists, you might have multiple antagonists. In those cases, you can almost break them down into smaller groupings. But for the most part, we're just going to look at a sort of centralized, simplified story plot structure where we're just having your typical single protagonist story. So with all that in mind, the takeaway there is that characters have a role and they can be distilled into the component elements. And those component elements, conversely, should combine into a whole that's more than the sum of its parts. So, what are these elements of character? Well, one of the key ones, of course, is motivations. And on top of that, you have needs and goals, which may sound very similar, and they definitely are related. But for the purposes of this discussion, we're going to look at them as different elements. And then we also have fears, and we have character strategies, and of course, personality. So I'm borrowing a lot from film writing here. I recently took a class in film techniques, and I found it personally very helpful as far as how to break down and analyze characters and look at the way they contribute to the story and how they interact with the plot. So film, like furry writing as well, has to rely a lot on its characters to really pull the weight of the story. And so we can actually learn a lot from film techniques even while writing prose. Let's look at motivation. So when we're talking about motivation in this context, this is a sort of broad, unmet, universal need that the character has. It's their central driving force. So this can be something like a need for love, for belonging, attention, validation, etc. It's generally going to be rooted in their backstory, and it could be caused by a trauma or just something that they lack, either internally or externally. And the motivation is going to be both their weakness, because it can be used against them and manipulated by the antagonist, and it can be their strength. It's the connection point for the reader, and it's what helps the reader empathize with the character. So this is a internal motivation towards fulfillment of their needs. Often unconsciously, like the character may not even be aware of this aspect. Now, it is going to engage with and be expressed through the external conflict, and in the end, it's going to be the deeper tension that needs to be addressed with the character. So really, we're talking about the character's own internal struggle to meet their needs and desires. The reason we want to differentiate needs and motivation here is the character can think that they're going after one particular thing, but actually they're motivated by something else. So, as an example, a character might be chasing after a nebulous idea of happiness through wealth, but actually what they're really motivated by is security for themselves, and they find that security in a found family or something of that nature. That's one of the many ways that can manifest with a tension between need and motivation. So, how is that different from a goal or objective? Well, when we're talking in literary and film terms, the goal of the character is their external driving force. So, This is often going to be related to their motivation, but it's going to be something concrete that's going to be achievable within the boundaries of the story. You can also have multiple goals. So, for example, if you're in writing a longer series, something like a Game of Thrones or a Wheel of Time kind of epic spanning multiple books, you'd have a larger overarching goal with many smaller goals along the way. Or many video games have this kind of plot structure where you have to defeat all the mini bosses until you finally face the big bad, right? Check off all those objectives. So you can kind of look at goals like that. As far as depending on the scope of your story, you may only have one particular goal to address in a given plot. But regardless, the goal is going to be something external that the character is chasing after, and it's going to be something very specific. So we don't want to have a goal that's just like the character wants to be rich. We want a goal like the character wants to win this tournament, which gives them a large payout of money so that they can accomplish X. Or, we don't want a goal of the character wants to fall in love. We want a goal like the character wants to form a romantic relationship with a specific person. So the goals provide a character with a series of challenging situations that allow them to grow, and which will help them fulfill their unmet needs. And again, this usually stems from their motivation. Now, the goal can also be something that's purely external, so it's established from outside. So, like for example, Lord of the Rings, Frodo has a goal to take the ring to Mount Doom. That's an external goal that's been sort of imposed upon him. Now he manifests that as a personal goal as he fights off the corruption of the ring, but initially that starts off as a purely external goal and motivation. We could probably have a long, in-depth character analysis on what Frodo's personal internal goals are, but we'll leave that aside for now and just look at the context of the exterior forces that are acting in that particular story. The next one is character strategy. So this is talking about what a character does to try and achieve their goals. So character strategies they should be consistent with the character, so their personality, their backstory, etc., their skills and competencies. And it should also be interesting, original, and hopefully still a little bit surprising. They can change strategies if their initial strategies aren't working, but depending on what your character model looks like, they're probably going to have a sort of go-to set of strategies to achieve what they want. So maybe, they use humor to disarm people and kind of get what they want that way. Or maybe they are very forceful and argumentative, or perhaps they're just a very good diplomatic person and are really good at using their words to get what they want and sort of sweet talking their way out of trouble. That's what we're talking about when we mean strategies. So you think of things like manipulate, seduce, persuade, etc., along those kinds of lines. So next one is fears, and this one's pretty self-explanatory. What is your character afraid of, and how does that affect them? So you think of like the Indiana Jones, of why does it have to be snakes? Things like that can pop up. But we also want to look at it more in the sense of their motivations. So, and we'll talk more about this in a little bit, but those two are almost going to be opposed to each other. The fear, the motivation is often going to be to overcome their deep internal fear in some way, whatever that internal fear is. So personality, again, seems fairly straightforward. There's going to be a lot of elements that go into their given personality, but their personality is really going to stem from their backstory. So again, you know, they might be outgoing, they might be introverted, they might be very funny, they might be charismatic, they might be, you know, very pious, they could be lots of different things. These all are elements of personality that we're going to look at. But it's going to stem from the backstory that you sort of build up for them. And you don't necessarily need to show all this backstory, but you, as the writer, you probably want to know at least a chunk of it, you know, where they're coming from and what subtextual forces are going to be acting upon them. So for example, like how did they grow up? What was their family like? What forces and experiences are going to come into play that will either help or make it more difficult for them to meet their need. Things like family, religion, finances, occupation, etc. And we also want to consider flaws when we're looking at personality. You know, are they rash? Are they greedy? Are they prideful? Whatever it might be. These are things we can look at to sort of augment their personalities. You know, most of our characters aren't going to be paragons. Most of our characters shouldn't be paragons. We want to create an effective illusion of real people, and real people are flawed. How do we actually apply all of this? So there's a few different methods for building characters, but I just want to talk about a couple that I've personally used and found quite effective. So the first one is something of an archetype model. Now, when we talk about character archetypes, these are sort of very broad brush, tropey character types where you can just sort of pull that off the page and say that this is this model. Something like, you know, the grizzled veteran, or the gentle giant, or the tsundere, or anything like that, where it's easily identifiable to the reader or to the watcher, and they're a little bit one-dimensional perhaps, but we take that as a starting point. So you know, tropes, like anything, are tools, and we can use them effectively. And so we take that archetype, whatever one we feel is going to be best for our story, and we use that as our building block. And what we do from there is we want to take unique elements and add them to our building block. And I'm talking about things like interests, could be physical traits, could be something like the way they speak, it could be a backstory element, it could be some weird artifact that they carry around, anything that's going to set them apart from other characters in the story and other characters just in the wider world of literature, ideally. And for your main characters, you generally want them to have like at least three or four of these. For side characters, you're probably okay with just one or two. So you want something that's going to set the character apart from just being a cardboard cutout. You know, these sort of unique elements, like, you know, maybe they have just a weird scar or something that your reader is going to remember, and it sets them apart from guy on the street 1 to, oh, that person that I remember. So one example that comes to mind, just as a good application of this technique, Brandon Sanderson has a lot of unique and interesting characters in his writing, and the main character of the Reckoner series, his main thing is that he tells really bad puns, and that's just something that's memorable about the character. And you can take something like that and put it on one of these archetypes with a few other elements, and you'll immediately have a fairly functional character. Now, you'll still want to consider things like backstory, motivations, goals, etc. But as far as building that personality, this is going to be a good starting point. Now, another method we can use, which again I've found quite effective, is based on something called the Enneagram. And there's a video in the link below done by a guy named Josh Keefe, who kind of breaks this down, the Enneagram model, and shows how it can apply to fictional characters. So in fact, I'm not going to go too deeply into what that is, because his video does that a lot more effectively. But essentially what it is a personality typing model that really takes into account things like motivations and fears. And as you can see from what we've already talked about, that's very useful for us as writers. So with this sort of approach, you can look at the various Enneagram types and just kind of put on your writer hat and analyze them a little and think about, for this type of story you're writing, what's going to be the best fit for your character's personality. And for me personally, I usually look at this through the lens of fears. So like, for example, you might say your main character's greatest fear is security. So that's going to put them at the type 6 on the Enneagram. And their greatest need is to have security, and their greatest fear is a lack of security. So that's that sort of opposing motivation and fear that I was talking about earlier. Or, maybe they fear being unloved. That's going to put them at the type 2, and their greatest motivation is to be loved and accepted by those around them. And so from there, you want to give them kind of unique factors that's going to identify them from other characters, and you want to look at their backstory and kind of figure out where they're coming from, and they're going to need to have a goal that's hopefully stemming from their motivations. So yeah, this model can honestly be really useful because it gives you a fairly full spectrum analysis of what your character's internal motivations are going to be. And also on top of that, it gives you an idea of what that character's personality is going to look like against other characters. So for example, you might see where like the friction points between like a type 9 and a type 8 might have. And you can use that as a tool to figure out, okay, well, these two characters are these two types of personalities, and they're going to just rub each other the wrong way because of that. So this can just be a really helpful tool for us in that sense. Yeah, so that's a couple of techniques you can use to help build characters from the ground up. We can also look at the Enneagram model as an analysis tool to help us figure out maybe what characters are lacking if there's something that's not working. Usually you're going to find that's something to do with their motivations or their goals, or just there's a missing piece there. And that you can use that as sort of a tool to break down and figure out what's missing. So I've talked a little about breaking down characters and character tropes. Overly Sarcastic Productions has a really great video series all about writing tropes, so I'd highly recommend checking that out. And the Writing Excuses podcast is also a really great resource for writers. It's hosted by Brandon Sanderson, Dan Wells, Mary Robin Kowal, and Howard Taylor. Again, link below. There's lots of great content on there, and it'll be really helpful for you in developing your work. As for myself, I'm Arcane Reno. You can find me online, either So Furry or For Affinity under that name. I've also got some work in multiple anthologies that you can check out. There's a couple new ones that are coming out from Thurston Howell Publications. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you find it helpful, and good luck with your writings. Take care.